Hello at 407-507. This is Mrs. Brown. I just wanted to let you know that this is the ELL presentation, and you can access this via PowerPoint. And there are also resources and strategies, the PSYOP strategies underneath session resources within Blackboard, and then underneath the ELL folder. I'm bringing this into context because it's very important that we don't leave this out when we're working with students in special education, because there's a lot of strategies that work for not only ELL students but also IEP students as well as most students, but especially for students who are both, who are ELL as well as special ed. So I wanted to let you know that this was a presentation that was done last year live, or last semester live, by Sandra Owen, and due to our setting and our structure of this semester, I'm not going to be able to have her come live, but I still wanted to share her presentation and strategies with all of you. She has included her emails down here below, so if you have any questions or concerns or have any other thoughts or anything that you would like to know more about, she's an excellent resource. What I want you to get out of for this presentation is the importance of knowing your ELL students, the stages of language acquisition, how to create effective lesson plans based on the stages of language acquisition, practice some PSYOP strategies, and she has on here on her PowerPoint that she's not really strong in technology, so please forgive her presentation. But I know I just want to give you those strategies that you can implement quickly. So let's go ahead and discuss real quick the importance of knowing your ELL students. One thing that is very crucial is that you might come across students who are both ELL as well as special education. They're labeled with a disability, but they're also ELL. This is very rare, or at least it should be. If there are a lot of schools within your, or excuse me, if there are a lot of students within your school, that is a problem, because there is either a misidentification, because the amount of work and effort and testing that has to go on to do both is insane and takes a really, really long time. So I've been in the situation where I've had a student who was tested and was placed on an IEP, but was tested and didn't pass her state place exam for ELL due to the fact of her disability. And the issue is, once they get identified and they've scored poorly on the place, they have to continue taking that test until they've reached proficiency within English, even though a student might have a disability. The reason why my student got identified is because parent has shared that there was Spanish spoken within the home the year after she was identified with an IEP. So that puts everybody in a very difficult situation, and her try was extenuous. So I just wanted to give you some information about that. Typically, what has to happen is, once a student is identified to have a language issue, it's very difficult to also prove that there's a learning disability. And some districts choose to either do one or the other, but not technically try to do both, because it's very difficult to do so. However, if both have to happen and you have a student who comes into that category, here's what has to happen. The student still has to be identified ELL and has to go through all of that testing to prove where their proficiency and fluency is at. So that's separate, but it's still wove together. I know that sounds kind of backwards. As far as IEP goes, you have to prove a disability, but you don't just prove the disability with just everyday documentation that we have within schools. We have to also provide documentation in their native language. So let's say a student native language is Spanish. We have to test them. For example, like if I gave a Woodcock Johnson, I couldn't just give a Woodcock Johnson in English. I'd also have to give it into Spanish, and the results have to be identical. Or if they're not identical and they perform better on the Spanish version, that would be a good indicator that the language barrier is a problem. If they score about the same, then obviously we know to go from there. But what becomes really challenging and really difficult is if a student's native language is obviously not a language that is common within where we live in Colorado. We had a student come from Nepal. That's very, very difficult to prove that there's a disability, because unless you have somebody who's from Nepal and knows the language to test in special education to be qualified, it gets a little tricky. So typically a whole team is involved in that process, and it usually incorporates the district special education director. That's how high up this goes. So it's, like I said, it's a very, very rare, but in those rare instances, we have to know what to do for those students. But my goal of this, not to be such a downer, but my goal of this is really to give you the strategies from Mrs. Owens that you can use within your classroom. So let's go ahead and look at the PRISM model. In order to teach a student who's a second language learner, you must first understand where he has come from and where he is now. To reach a child's mind, a teacher must capture his heart, is a great philosophy to think of. You have to build that rapport with a student before you can really go any further to get into what they're cognitively able to do. So, getting that rapport built, understanding the child's background, what the child is interested in, what the child has preferences for, is very, very important, because you're going to build such a stronger connection than just trying to go straight to, okay, this is how we add, this is how we subtract, etc. An easy way to do this, which is really, really fun, is doing your life in 3 pictures. She has an example here, and I'm going to share her story real quick. Her first memory of her life at the very beginning was when she went to kindergarten for the first day of school, and she remembers she was clenching onto her mother's leg because she was just so scared to take that next step of her life, and to go to school was really frightening for her. And I think relating this to a student who has come to a new country possibly, or is learning a new language, that apprehension relation might make the child feel more comfortable, because you can really see just in a picture what's going on. The next part of her life was a big change of her life was when she had met her husband. And obviously, as we all know, when we meet significant others and go down that journey, it certainly opens up a new world for us, and it's a milestone within our lives. The next milestone that she had in her life was when she had her twins, and this is her greatest accomplishment, she always says, having her twins. She has a boy and a girl, and they're finally past their toddler stage, so she's very, very happy. And being a mommy to twins, as most people know who've been through that, is very, I mean, raising children together is very, very difficult, but when you have more than one of them, it's even more challenging. But she had an extra bonus of challenge when she had her son. Her son was diagnosed with Down syndrome. And so that in itself, he's a complete delight. He cracks me up. He definitely challenges her all the time, but she is a great mom, and she's learning some great strategies. But that in itself has opened up a new world for her as well. So do you see how easily it is to understand somebody with just 3 pictures? So having students do this is really great for them once you are able to show this. And it doesn't even need to be verbal, is the most important thing. Okay, to move on, there are stages of language acquisition. You have pre-production, early production, speech emergency, intermediate fluency, and advanced fluency. What's really great is she's broken this down for you for what typical student characteristics are, the behaviors you will see, and strategies of what you need to do as a teacher. So for example, if a student is at the pre-production stage, for a teacher, it's really great to avoid forcing the student to speak prematurely and allow for times of silence. For that student, and it goes all the way up. So please take the time to read through this. To give you some ELL verbiage, if you might be sitting in a meeting, you might be hearing the word BICS, which is the basic interpersonal communication skills. This is our social language, the language we use every day to communicate with one another. And then there's the CALPS, which are the cognitive academic language proficiency, and this is academic language. So for example, we've just got done doing math. Any vocabulary really in the field of math is considered to be cognitive academic language, such as using the word area or perimeter or quadrilateral or whatever. All of those obviously are academic and not used typically in social language. As you know, social language comes a lot faster than academic language does, so we typically have to really instruct for the academic language. Getting to know your students, knowing whether they're a first language or a second language. There's no harm in dumpster diving. If you can dumpster dive online, which is what I do all the time, you can find a lot of different strategies out there that can really work with students who, if it's their first or second language, really, if they do have an ELL, if they're identified as ELL, there is a plan on them, and you should check that out, read through it, talk with the ELL teacher, and plan accordingly from there. Check their CUME file as well, and also find out maybe if they're a migrant family. Biography cards is another great activity to do to really get a quick understanding of their background. You might be able to do this with your students if they have somewhat of an English proficiency. If they don't, you might need to be doing this on your own by going through their files. And here's an example of a secondary CLD student biography card. So you can come in here and kind of fill out the information, and she's given some suggestions on the bottom as to what needs to go into those columns as just a real quick reference for yourself to go through. Your group interactions. This is your TPSI. You're looking at the total class where modeling proficient English is very important, whether you're doing partners, whether you're doing a small team, or whether you're doing things individually. And the recommendation is make sure that you've tried other group interactions prior to doing individually, because you are providing more opportunities for them to be enriched in that English language. And the more you pull them out, the more they're missing that opportunity to have that English presented to them. But keep in mind that individuals still might be needed if there's certain things that can be worked on one-on-one with that student. Here's some more just grouping interaction on how that can look. So please read through this. So here's her 5 steps to setting up an interactive learning group. You want to complete those biographies. You want to determine what the academic purpose for your grouping is. Determine what the task and outcomes are to be. Reflect on those biographies and see how you can group better by looking at maybe common interest. And then authentically assessing their work within the group is her 5 strategies that she goes by. Make sure you create very effective lessons by having objectives for reading, writing, speaking, and listening built in. Leaving one of those out is not a good idea. Students will practice identifying new words. And if, for example, you could use a Magic Book, which is a graphic organizer, which is really fun. And it's easy to make. If you use any of Dinah Sykes' resources, she has a whole series on different foldables, and I love them, love them. But using those type of graphic organizers are fun for kids, and it really allows them to work on different skills by having that vocabulary practice, for example. There's some PSYOP strategies that are listed, and I know her next few slides are all about those. There's one on the 4 square activity where you basically take a piece of paper into 4 parts, and you have 4 different components. You have the key term, you have an example in writing, you might have an example that might not be writing, and then you have a definition of it. You could also do a vocabulary quilt where you're making a larger piece that could be divided into 6 or 8 sections and writing down key vocabulary. And instead of always having to have words, that students could just draw or come up with whatever comes to mind to relate to that vocabulary word. This is a good activity if you want to do this yourself, but put these ideas and words, vocabulary terms, onto a piece of paper and see what you would come up with for yourself on what your vocabulary, what's the first thing that comes to your mind. It's a great idea just to get you the understanding of how that strategy works. You can spend 2 minutes about writing down anything you like. You could do pictures, phrases, sentences, etc. Think of anything that you can put down. And if there's anything that you're unsure of, just put a question next to it. Tips. You can pass out sticky notes to students throughout a unit, and they could add to the vocabulary words, and you could just hang your quilt up in your room. That's really fun to do. You can hand out specific colors to EL students so you can easily track their responses of what once they are able to master what that word means. You can create individual vocabulary quilt for students who need extra support to keep at their desk. You can add words to vocabulary books or word walls, and you can only require students to learn about 3 new vocabulary words a day. It's very, very important that you're not overloading them with too much all at once. And there's the breakdown of those, so you could check for yourself. The Magic Book we just talked about, but uses for that Magic Book or graphic organizers are for vocabulary, math, facts, science, social studies, spelling words, vocabulary from books, etc. There's also a DOTS activity that you can go through. There's more of a write-up in your PSYOP strategy book, so our resource handout, so please look at that. I hope you've learned a few more strategies and understand a little bit more about ELL, especially when relation into special education. If you have any questions or need anything, as always, you can either email Sandy Owen directly, or you can call me. Thanks, and I hope you guys have a great week.